Morning, Berea. It is a great privilege to be with you guys once again and to be able to keep on going through the book of Hebrews. Today we're going to jump back into chapter 11. We're going to finish chapter 11 today. And to kind of start off, I want to give just a quick recap from last week. So last week we started looking at the chapter in Hebrews, chapter 11, is arguably the most famous chapter within the book of Hebrews. It's famously titled the Hall of Faith, but after looking at it, I want us to look at it and see that these are all different heroes of the faith. And last week, what we had done was we had gone up to verse 22 and looked at all of those heroes that were mentioned in the book of Hebrews that just came from the book of Genesis alone. Now, the author is not going to go through every single character in the Old Testament, but what he's going to do, he's going to go through a few more of these hugely important Old Testament characters. And how he's going to conclude this chapter is with an encouragement of remaining strong in this race of the faith. So with that being said, let us open up with a word of prayer and then jump into the book of Hebrews. God, we just come before you today and we just give you so much thanks for your word and all that it has. We give you thanks that we can look upon these heroes of the faith and look back. Allow these people to encourage us to remain strong and faithful in you. In Jesus' name, amen. So, with that being said, I want to go ahead and just jump into chapter 11 and start at verse 23. And we're going to be the first character we're going to be looking at here is Moses. And in verse 23, here's what the author of Hebrews says about Moses. It says, by faith, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God rather than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Esteemed the reproach of Christ greater than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. And by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by a dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. So as you look at this character of Moses, we see quite a few things mentioned about him. And the first thing, one of the most important things, is that he was raised up by these Egyptians. Now, in the story of Exodus and in Moses' life, there was a decree that was brought upon to kill all the firstborn children, all the firstborn male children of 2 years and younger. And why this had happened was because the Israelites or the Hebrew people, they were dwelling within the land of Egypt, and they were growing at a rapid pace. So what the Pharaoh of Egypt had done was he had put them into slavery, and he wanted to help consolidate his power. And he saw they were growing and growing. So in order to help curb that growth, he sent out a decree to kill all the Hebrew little children, all the Hebrew boys. And what had happened is the parents of Moses, they had the child and they saw he was a beautiful child and they could not give up this child. They wanted to spare his life. And when he was around 3 months old, the parents realized they could no longer hide this child. So what they had done is they had built this reef and they put him down the Nile River. And of all the people to possibly get him, to find this child in the river, the Egyptians find him. More importantly, the house of Pharaoh. The same house, the same family that put this decree in the place to kill Moses and to kill all these Hebrew little babies, was the same family that found this child in the river. And in doing so, he was taken in by the family. He was raised up under this Pharaoh. He was raised up in all the glory, all the luxury of that would have been given and offered to him. And even though this had happened, what we see is Moses, he still rejected this temptation of this lavish lifestyle before him. He had every opportunity to enjoy and indulge in the sinful pleasures of the world and that of Egypt and of Pharaoh and the king's house, but he chooses not to. And what we see is even from the beginning of Moses' life, how the hand of God has been upon him to spare his life, to be raised up in this culture that completely goes against the will of God, that goes against all that stands of God. And we see Moses standing up in this culture, remaining as a faithful Hebrew child, a Hebrew man. And what is interesting is that even though he could have done these things, he recognized his people, he recognized where he came from, and he made sure that he was going to be dedicated to following that way of life, that way of the Hebrew life. One that didn't follow the God of the culture or the lifestyle that they lived, but one that followed the one and true only God. He wanted to be associated with his people, and he rejects all these things. I think similarly today we live in this culture where it wants to do everything that goes against the will of God. It wants to do everything that it can to go against that which God calls acceptable. And it finds its own things to call acceptable, to call good, to call true. But what we have to do, as same what Moses had to do, is stand up against those temptations, not to give in to the things that culture calls acceptable, but rather to stand up to what is right in the eyes of God. And this is what Moses had done. He, as it says, he chose to suffer with the people of God rather to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Moses, he decides to go against everything he could have, everything he was raised with, and follow God. Now, in doing so, he ended up facing a lot of persecution. In the story of the Exodus, in the story of Moses' life, he kills a Hebrew slave. He flees Egypt for a long time. God calls him back to help free his people, and he uses Moses, this one who would have been well aware of the Egyptian culture, well aware of where he was at, to help free his people. And in doing so, he would have had to stand up before the king. He would have had to stand up before the Pharaoh in order to do so. And he does this, he comes back and he starts to go before the king, and he's requesting that God's people be brought out to worship. And the Pharaoh over and over again rejects his request. And each time this happens, these plagues come upon Egypt, and they keep progressively getting worse and worse. And at the conclusion of these plagues is this plague, or this idea of the Passover, in which the Hebrews were instructed to slay a lamb and to spread the blood of this lamb across the doorpost of their house. And in doing so, by faith, if they believed that God was going to do what he said, this angel of death would have passed over the house and spared the firstborn. And all those who did not do this, their firstborn children, were going to be killed. There would be judgment brought upon this land. Now, Moses believes this. He believes in this passing over. And what happens is the firstborn of those who did not believe were killed. And at this point, as Pharaoh finally comes to his senses and he lets the people of Egypt go. And you would hope that the story would end there. You would think that the story of Moses and doing all that he'd done with the 10 plagues would finally end, but that's not what happens. The story keeps on going, and we see in the final part of the story that the author of Hebrews brings out that they passed through the Red Sea on dry land. Now, in the story in the Exodus, Moses comes up to this Red Sea and is instructed by God to strike his staff down, and the seas are going to part open, and they are going to walk through it as if it was dry land. And what we see in this story is, even though as crazy as this sounded, By faith, Moses has seen all that God had done up to this point. Therefore, he had no reason to believe and no doubt that God would not continue to do what he had said he was going to do, especially in relationship to freeing his people. And what happens is the Red Sea opens, the people walk on through on dry land, and once again, the Egyptians, the Pharaoh sends out this army to try to recapture his people. Now, they thought they were going to be able to walk through, and as the story concludes, the sea closes and it drowns the army. And what we see is that all the people of God have been safely brought through this sea, safely brought out of captivity, and now they were on a destination to the promised land. Now, what we see in all these different aspects of Moses' life is how he didn't do so by any human standard. He didn't do these things by any logical standard or by the people around him. Rather, he'd done all these things in faith. He recognized that he was a Hebrew and by faith followed his people. He recognized that while these plagues, they seemed impossible by any human standard, because God had said he was going to do these things, by faith he followed him. We see that by faith, he was able to walk through the Red Sea. Now, one of the things that kind of strikes me as odd about the author of Hebrews' retelling of Moses is how he doesn't seem to mention many of the other great things Moses had done. We get up to this point of passing through the Red Sea, and then if you read this chapter, it goes into Joshua next. But Moses' story doesn't end there. Moses, he delivers the 10 Commandments to the people. He gives them the entire law. He establishes the Levitical priesthood. He scouts out the promised land. He led the people for 40 years in the land. And the author doesn't mention any of these things. Rather, he talks about the things such as the Passover and the passing through the sea, all these things that were the set in way or the set motion to the fulfilling of the promises that have been given to those before. Lastly, we looked at Abraham and the promises that were given to him about this land that was to come one day. And Moses, as we go on in the story, Moses is now here and he's helping to fulfill that promise. Now, unfortunately, Moses, he does not, because of his doubt at one point, he does not get to see the promised land. But at the end of his life, one of his final requests that he gets to at least see it from a distance. And what happens is, as Moses, just before his death, he goes up onto a mountain, and he's able to see the promised land from a distance. And it seems that he has great hope and comfort in that, knowing that this next generation that was to come would be able to see the blessings and the fulfillment of this land. And I believe like many of those before Moses that had died in faith, they died knowing that those promises were not yet fulfilled. Even though Moses could not see the fulfillment of these promises, it seems that by faith he died knowing these things would be fulfilled. And establishing the law and establishing all that he had done and freeing the people, this is all part of God's sovereign plan to bring his people and to fulfill this promise. And we see all this has been accomplished not by Moses' intuition, by his strength, by his own personal achievements, but only by faith alone. Only by faith is he able to do all these great things. The next character, the next hero of faith that we see in this book is Joshua. And in verse 30, it tells us this. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. So Joshua, in the story of the Israelite people, he is his predecessor to Moses. He comes after him. He's the one who takes charge of the people after Moses. And the author of Hebrews only recounts the falling of the walls. But this is not the only thing that Joshua had did. In the story of in the book of Numbers, we see that Moses decides to send these spies into the promised land. And he sends 12 spies. And these spies, they go into the land, and they're supposed to scout out the land. They're supposed to see strategic places to conquer and kind of see what is to be expected of this great land that God has promised. Now, unfortunately, the 12 spies come back, and 10 of them, all they see is the difficulty ahead. They see the number of armies that are there, the amount of kings they have to conquer, the size of the armies, the fortifications of these walls, and all you would say are legitimate concerns. These are real fears that they would have. But the problem is, they had these fears, and they have forgotten God's promises. They didn't just have these fears about what they had to face, but they had them, and they have forgotten that God had already promised them this land, had promised to give them victory. Now Joshua, along with Caleb, another spy who goes into the land, they come back, and they talk about the greatness of this land. They talk about how great it's going to be, how the milk and the honey is flowing abundantly, how it's a prosperous land, and it's great places to establish homes and territories. But because they could only see the problems ahead, they turned their focus, and they lost their faith in what God had already promised them. They didn't seem to believe that God was going to carry them through all these battles and deliver them through all these things, even though they have already seen how God had done so many great things. That's because of that this generation of Moses dies off, and the next generation, which Joshua ends up leading into the land, is able to see these things. Because they believed, and Joshua believed, that these things were true. What God had said was going to happen, and delivering them into this land, to conquer this land, to have this home, and have this place where God would dwell with them, Joshua is set apart as the example of faith. In the book of Joshua, they finally enter the land. And the first city they have to conquer is the city of Jericho. And what they do is they don't put together this elaborate plan to try to bring down the walls and figure out where to position troops, or rather, God comes and takes over the battle, and he instructs them just to walk around this wall for 7 days. And while they was doing, you would expect the next thing to be walk on this wall and then conquer it, and then attack it, but no. What they had to do was believe that God would deliver them, that God would fight this battle for them. And fortunately for the people, they did. And because of that, the way Joshua is remembered is as one who believed in this promise that these walls are going to fall down, and they do fall down, and the people win this battle. And it's the first battle they win in this promised land. It's a great story. It's great to see how finally the people of God fully believed in God, and they trusted him, and now they're finally seeing the fulfillment of this land that has been promised to them. But there's more to that story. In verse 31, we see, here's what it says. It's this final person that's mentioned in detail in this book, in this chapter. It says, by faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. So in this story of Joshua and this bringing down of the walls, what Joshua had done was he had actually sent in spies to go check out the city of Jericho. He wanted to see what was going to happen, how they were going to get past these walls, because these walls, according to historians, were thick enough to where you could ride a chariot across the top. Apparently they had a track where a whole chariot could ride across the top of this wall. So it had to be 3 to 4 feet thick for this chariot to be able to walk across the entire perimeter of the wall. And with that, it's a ginormous wall. It's a great fortification. And the people of Israel, they have no idea how to go to break in there. And even if they do, what are they going to do once they actually break down these walls? So as a strategic leader, Joshua sends in these spies to scout out the city. And these spies, they go into the city, they're scouting it out, and word gets back to the king that Israelite spies have entered the city. And nighttime's coming, the gates are going to be closing, so these spies have to find a place to hide. They need to find a place to hunker down until the morning when the gates open once again. Because once those gates close, there was no way of them getting out and getting back to their encampments. So what they end up doing is they find the house of Rahab, and they stay there for the night, and she hides them. So what Rahab had done is she hid the spies as they entered into this land. Now Rahab is not an Israelite. She's one of these Gentiles. She's a harlot. She's not a righteous woman by any standard. But she decides to hide the Israelite people. Now, if you turn to the book of Joshua, in chapter 2, we actually see a reason to why she does this. And in Joshua 2, it says this. Now, before the spies lay down, Rahab came up onto the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard now how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Ammonites, who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is the God of heaven above all. He is the God of heaven above and on the earth beneath. Now therefore I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you will also show kindness to my family, to my father's house, and give me a true token. And spare my father and my mother and my brother and my sisters and all that they may have, and deliver our lives from death. So the spies answered her, our lives for yours, if none of you tell the business of ours. And it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, we will deal kindly and truly with you. So what we see here is that these spies, they come to the house of Rahab. Rahab decides to hide them because she has heard and now has believed what God has done. Now, for us, we read this, and in our Bibles, we go from the book of Deuteronomy to the book of Joshua. And if you think of the timeline, there's about a 40-year gap from the crossing of the Red Sea to the book of Joshua. So this story of God delivering the people from Egypt, of defeating these kings that had happened in the book of Numbers, this had taken place years ago. And even though it took place so long ago, they still feared that this judgment would come upon them. And Rahab's heart melted. Now, what we see in her confession is that she declares that God is the God of heaven. We see this profession of faith that when she sees the people, she sees these spies, she recognizes that everything that she has heard is definitely true. She decided to go against any of the gods that she would have probably worshipped and declare that this God, the God of these spies, the God of the Hebrew people, is the one and true living God. And by her faith, because of that faith, because of the story that she heard long ago of what God had done, she had hid these spies on her rooftop. It is by faith of what God had done before, by the retelling of the stories throughout time and history, that these people, what Rahab seems to tell us, that these people recognize that they can't do anything about it. Now, unfortunately, we don't have an account of other people coming to God and trusting him, but what we do see is that Rahab, this harlot, this unrighteous, adulterous woman, believes in God. And later in the story, when Jericho was conquered, her and her family are redeemed. They're kept safe, and they're brought to live as the Gentiles among the nation of Israel. It is by her faith and the profession of God and believing what God had done long ago that her family had been saved. It's by faith that she had believed in these things and then hid the spies on her roof. It's by faith that she could trust that these spies would keep their word. Because what had happened in this story is that the king's men, they come to the house that she's at, and they ask her if they have seen these spies. And what she could have done was say, yes, I saw them. They're actually on my roof. You guys can go ahead and take them. But she doesn't. She actually lies to the king's men, and she said they've gone into the mountains. So the king's men open up the gate, and they start chasing into the wind, trying to run into the wind, trying to find these spies. But Rahab, knowing full well that they have no chance of finding these spies. Because she knows that if it comes between the king of this earth and the king of heaven, that one king could reign forever. And she wants to make sure she's on the right side of history. So even though she was an adulterous woman, she had a reputation for what she had done, by her faith, God still redeemed her. He showed his grace and mercy upon her due to her belief and trust that God was going to bring upon these things. So in Hebrews chapter 11, this is the last person that the author goes into in detail. We do see he's going to mention a couple other people, but he ends his section of faith by saying, by faith, Rahab the harlot. This is the last person, this Gentile, adulterous person, is the last person given in detail about their faith. But the story doesn't end there. It's not as if the author of Hebrews neglects other people of the faith. He goes on, he talks about those beyond the hall of faith, or those beyond this section. And in passing, he says this in verse 32. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell Samuel and of the prophets. So, all these people, if you read the stories within the Old Testament, had hugely important times and trials where they had to stand up by their faith. And what fascinates me the most about this is that he just kind of passes over David. Now, I know part of what he's doing, he's trying to go chronologically in order of these different heroes of the faith. But he leaves out David, which strikes me as odd because in the Jewish faith, and David was regarded as one of the greatest kings, if not the greatest king Israel ever had. He is described as a man after God's own heart. He takes over from King Saul. He helps lead the people of Israel to follow God righteously. He becomes the epitome of a godly king. Now, he does have his downfalls. There's no way of downplaying that. But he seeks repentance, and he comes back to God. But he doesn't seem to go into that. Rather, what he's trying to get at is by faith, all these different men and women, these prophets, ones that time would not have us to tell, have done great things for God. Not knowing the outcome of what was going to happen, not knowing what the outcome of the life would have even been, but by faith, never failed to have the trust in God. By faith, never forsook God and his promises. By faith, walked with him, even though they had their downfalls, they also accomplished great things by faith. But then the story goes on, and he kind of starts turning it now to what would have been his current audience at the time, but also talking about more people of the Bible in his mentioning. So in verse 34, he says, by faith, or he's continuing on this idea of verse 32. Sorry, in verse 33, he says, who worked through faith, they subdued kingdoms, they worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight armies of the allies, women received the dead raised to life again, others tortured and not accepting deliverance that they may obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mockings and scourings, yes, and of chains of imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, slain by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy, and wandered into deserts and the mountains, into dens and the caves of the earth. So what we see here is those by faith, all these people who I mentioned, they had to overcome great and, in a sense, horrible things. Violence. Some of them had done great things. They conquered kingdom, they led armies. But others, they were martyred for their faith. They were died in order to keep this faith. When many had the opportunity to not deny God, they decided to walk by faith and to trust in God. Even if they were tempted to deny the faith, they never walked away. As part of why the story lives on is because they never walked away from the faith. When it comes to thinking of the Christian faith and the faith that we have now that we hold fast to, one of the things that has helped the Christian faith to stand out among any other religion is the fact that since the beginning of its time, it's faced great persecution and has not shrunk or gone stagnant, but rather it has grown in the midst of that persecution. When it comes to looking at, and you look at Rome and in the history of Rome, many of the emperors were against the Christians because they were teaching that there was this one true God, that there was only one way to salvation. Whereas their culture would have taught that there was many gods and that there was different ideas of paradise and all these different modes or different beliefs on what was going to happen after death. But the Christians, they would say this thing and they would say that all these other gods are wrong. And for that, they were persecuted, they were stoned, they were tormented, they were killed for their faith or martyred for their faith. And even though they were martyred, the faith kept on growing more and more and more rather than shrinking, because those who had saw and witnessed and heard this message recognized that there's something different about this faith. That the Christian faith is not one that stands to just seek the pleasures of the flesh and live as great as we possibly can, but rather it seeks a greater purpose, a heavenly purpose. It's by faith all these different men and women throughout all of history, throughout the biblical history and on forth, kept their faith. Because their eyes were not set upon the things of this world, but like all these people in the book of Hebrews and on, they were set upon heavenly promises, things that were to come in the future. They were ultimately seeking something that was better. And in verse 39 goes on to tell us a bit about this. And it says, and all those that have been talked about, all those who have been persecuted, all those who died for their faith, having obtained a good testimony through faith, they did not receive their promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy was set before him, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So what we see here is all these men and women who have died for their faith. They didn't get to see the promise of great blessing and prosperity in life, but they died believing that they would one day come in heaven, that they would be with God face to face, and they would be able to enjoy everlasting peace with him. And they had done so, and they expected things better. And what these people had was they had a testimony of faithfulness. They set their eyes upon Jesus and everything that they did, and that became the testimony of faithfulness. They fled from sin. They recognized the reality of the sinful world, and they knew the temptations and the struggles and the curse of it. And they made sure they fled from that. And they all had done so because they set their eyes upon Jesus. They just set their eyes upon things that they could see, but something greater beyond themselves that they could not yet see. Now, when I read these stories, I'm inspired by them. I love them, and it helps encourage my faith. Because I get to see how God had to work throughout history and throughout the biblical story of these different great men and women of the faith. And it helps to encourage and strengthen my faith, and I hope it does for you as well. But I know one of my temptations that I can easily fall into is thinking, in one sense, that these guys may have had it a bit easier because they heard directly from God. So one temptation I could have, and I know I've had, is that, well, of course they followed God. They heard the voice of God. How could they not follow God? One of the things that has helped greatly strengthen my faith was, of course, hearing these stories, but also hearing the stories of those throughout history, beyond the biblical story, and how they had endured the faith. How even though they didn't hear directly from God, that they stood strong for the faith, no matter what had happened. And there are two stories in particular that have just always stood out to me, that have just inspired me in my faith. The first one takes place back in during the Black Death, the Black Plague, and what happened, as we know in history, this plague came upon Europe and it killed millions and millions of people. And what was happening is that these cities that would get infected, the healthy would leave, and the sick and poor would be left ultimately to die. Now, what had happened is the Christians, they saw that this was happening, and they recognized that these people are at the end of their life, they're sick, they have nothing, their families have left them, and they're going to die without having any hope and faith in anything. And a group of Christians, what they decided to do was create this movement where they would go back into these cities with food and water, medical supplies, and ultimately the gospel. And by faith they had done this, hoping that at the end of their life, that these people would put their faith in Jesus. And unfortunately, many of these Christians who went in, they ended up dying from this plague, because they had contracted it and there was no cure for it. But they had done so by faith, knowing that their reward was not in this life, but it was for something greater. And there's many great stories of how these Christians have went into cities when kings and governments had told them not to and kicked them out at times. When they rejected that, and they went in and they shared the gospel and helped to treat these people. You saw a difference that how people came back, they've recovered from this plague, and they began to believe in Jesus, and the gospel began to spread because of that. Now, they didn't know what was going to happen. They probably knew that if they went into these cities where the plague was happening, they were going to die, and they had done so anyways. And they became martyred for the faith, but they done so because their eyes are ultimately set upon Jesus. Another story that I've always loved is about a missionary. at the turn of the 20th century, as missions was growing around the world, there was this one man who was sent to a country in South Africa, and he lived in the village that was on the border of a country. And the idea was that as people would travel from one country to another through this village, that he would get opportunity to witness the gospel, the witness of the gospel, and bring people to Christ. And he had done that. He'd gone, he set up his camp, he learned the language of his people, he started writing up this Bible for them. And for years, he started doing his work of mission. He would speak of Jesus Christ, but unfortunately, not many people would come to believe in Jesus. And what had happened is the mission organization he was reporting to had ultimately said, we need to take our resources and put them elsewhere. Because what's happening in this place is that people are just not accepting Christ. We need to be able to take our funding, put it elsewhere where we know people are going to start up a new work. So what he was told to do was come back to the States, we'll reevaluate, we'll find a different place for you to go. And he decided not to go. He said, I'm going to stay here. I know this is what God has called me, and I'm going to stay here. They said, we can't support you any longer if you do. And by faith, he took his step. He knew God's calling on his life, and he stayed in this country. And for years, he still kept on sharing the gospel, and nothing was happening. And about 10, 15 years into his mission, as he was at his lowest point of discouragement, he started seeing people coming to Christ. It was through the longevity of his mission, of the standing of his faith, the truthfulness of his witness, that people began to see that there was something different about the God that he worshipped opposed to any of the other gods that they worshipped in their country. Ones that were always changing and never had a firm foundation. And what had happened is the gospel and the extent of Jesus Christ blew up all over this village in this country. And because of his faithfulness, even though he wasn't able to see for many years the fruit of his labor, he was able to, in part, see churches be finally established and people begin to train other people in the Bible. And I find it just so encouraging because of how long he had labored in the faith. He had labored knowing that his work didn't seem fruitful for years and years and years. And by all logical standards, he should have given up. From his friends, from his family, from the organization he came from, he was told to give up. But he knew God had put him there, and by faith that something was going to happen with these people. And unfortunately, if I remember correctly, he ends up dying about a year or two later after this growth finally starts to happen. But what happens is they keep on growing. And they establish more and more and more churches and Bible schools and hospitals. And because of his legacy, because of what he had done, even though he was able to see the full fulfillment of the fruit and the labor that he had done, generations later, it's still thriving to this day. It's still going, these people are now going and they're sending people out to share within their own country and grow the church. And I think the only reason he was able to stay strong and do this is because he had his faith set upon Jesus and nothing else. Now, as we look at closing up this chapter, as we look at seeing this idea of faith, the first thing I think faith helps us to do is look upon greater things. Help us to see Jesus. By faith, we can look ahead knowing that in this lifetime, we're not guaranteed that there's this promise of prosperity and wealth, but we have this hope and this promise that one day we will be with Jesus. And it's only by faith that we will be able to see that. Secondly, as we looked at this story and received Rahab, we see that God can redeem anybody. There's no person that's too far from God to redeem. Just like the story of Rahab, those who come to believe in God, put their trust in him, will be redeemed. Or we think of the Apostle Paul. He was so far from the faith. He was killing Christians. And it was only by faith and trust in Jesus that a man like Paul, Saul at the time, could be redeemed. We see that God can truly redeem anybody, but it's only done by true faith. Next thing we see is by faith, we seek to flee any sin that traps us. I don't know what temptations you face. I don't know what sinful struggles you guys are struggling with, but I do know this, that we are all sinful human people. We all fall short from the glory of God. And I would encourage you, if there is a sin you are struggling with, so first confess to God, but also bring another godly friend or someone in to help you break free from this sin. Because the thing I would hate is for you to be entrapped by the sin and to feel like there's no hope for you. But what I can encourage you is that it's by faith. Faith helps us to lay aside every weight of sin. Doesn't mean that the temptation is still going to go away. Doesn't mean that the sin is just going to disappear like that. But what it does mean is that by faith, we begin to fight that temptation so that it no longer has a grip upon our lives, so that we can truly begin to walk and set our eyes upon Jesus. So if there is a sin you are struggling with, I would encourage you to bring a brother along and to help you overcome this sin. And lastly, we keep our eyes set upon Jesus. This is throughout this whole chapter, the whole story of what we see all throughout the book of Hebrews as it's talking about the greatness of Jesus. The author says here that we ought to set our eyes upon Jesus, that we look upon him as the finisher of our faith. Because he has endured all these things, and we can have our hope in him that one day we'll be able to be seated and be in his presence. I want that to be our hope. But that hope only comes if you have true faith in God. So that being said, let us pray. God, we just come before you today and we just give you so much thanks for your word, for the testimony it has of various men and women who have stood strong for the faith throughout history. We give you thanks for all that you've done upon the cross and upon all of our lives. And all that we do, let us fight and set aside sin and set our eyes upon you and you only. In Jesus' name, amen.
As today's worship service draws to a close, I extend my deepest thanks for joining us at Berea Bible Church. I'm Pastor Brian Miller, and it's been a privilege to guide you through the enriching and spiritually uplifting journey of our sermon series through the book of Hebrews. If today's message has touched your heart and you're eager to delve further into the supremacy of Christ and the new covenant he offers, I warmly invite you to visit us at Berea Bible Church. Our doors are open to you in north central Springfield, Ohio at 3850 Durr Road, nestled on the hill at the crossroads of Ohio State Route 334 and Durr Road. Our Sunday begins with a welcoming coffee fellowship at 8:30 a.m., followed by Sunday school sessions for all ages starting at 9 a.m. We then gather for our main worship service at 10 a.m., where our worship style is a harmonious blend set in a friendly and inviting atmosphere. For any questions or more information about Berea's ministries, including our exploration of the book of Hebrews, please reach out by calling our office at 937-399-9808, emailing info@bereabiblechurch.org, or visiting bereabiblechurch.org. We're here to support your spiritual journey. Once again, thank you for being with us. May God's blessing accompany you in all your endeavors. I look forward to welcoming you again as we continue to uncover the profound teachings and enduring faith presented in the book of Hebrews.